Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about Thunder Force. I'm just going to get my opinion of this movie out of the way right off the bat. This movie is terrible. It claims to be a superhero comedy, but there's little in the way of superhero action, and there's next to nothing in terms of actual comedy. The plot is focused on two girls named Emily and Lydia, who first meet each other in grade school. They quickly become best friends, and they spend a lot of time with each other over the years, and then inevitably there's a rift that happens in the friendship that causes them to go their separate ways, and the movie kicks off from there, so you know that they're going to reunite later in life as adults. Decades later in life, Emily reaches out to Lydia, which prompts Lydia to go to Emily's new workplace in the city, and they have a great reunion initially. Everything's all fine and dandy, they're having a good time, and then it's not long after that when the comedy antics really start ramping up and become really obnoxious, especially once Lydia gets injected with a serum that gives her the superpowers that this movie is heavily marketing. Seriously, the way Lydia got her superpowers in this movie made no sense to me. All she does is just sit in an ordinary looking leather chair, and the next thing you know, a device kicks in and she gets a bunch of needles injected into her forehead, and then everyone freaks out for a hot minute, and then everything calms down, and then Emily is just like, well, I guess you have superpowers now. Number one, that has to be the lamest way to gain a superpower that I've ever seen in a movie. And two, put a lock on the door. Why is Lydia able to access that room so easily? Seriously, the chair was just sitting right there in the middle of the room. It makes even less sense because Emily gets her superhero powers in a completely ordinary way by comparison. She just swallows a couple of pills and that's it. She's an instant superhero. Melissa McCartney is the actress who plays Lydia in this movie. And if you've ever seen a Melissa McCarthy movie before, a comedy movie anyway, then you're really not seeing anything different. It's more or less just Melissa McCarthy being Melissa McCarthy. The great majority of her jokes in this movie simply consist of her being loud and brash and just being as obnoxious as possible, combined with some really long, protracted ad-libs thrown in here and there, and some really gross body gestures for good measure, especially when it involves raw chicken. Oh my god, the gag with raw chicken went way too long in this movie. I have no idea why a random thing like raw chicken was such a big point of contention for Lydia in this movie, but this gag completely outstayed its welcome within 2 minutes of being introduced. And all it really is just Lydia making a bunch of gross noises and weird facial gestures whenever she eats piles and piles of the stuff. I just didn't understand the point behind it. There were a few funny lines that came out of Lydia here and there, but in typical McCarthy fashion, the joke just had to keep getting extended. There always had to be some sort of excuse to keep the joke going as long as possible. A joke that could have been told in 10 seconds goes on for like a minute in some scenes, and it's just like, okay, we get it, just stop. There's a gag near the beginning where Lydia is coming to terms with her powers, and she's having this long, protracted conversation with Emily about the character Urkel from Family Matters. The reason why she brings up Urkel is because Emily's daughter Tracy apparently looks like Urkel, and Lydia makes it a point to bring it up, which, number one, is plain rude, and number two, as I mentioned earlier, this gag goes on way too long. This leads into my thoughts about the next character in this movie, Emily, who's played by Octavia Spencer. Now, I just want to go on the record to say I love Octavia Spencer. I think she's one of the most talented actresses working in Hollywood today. But as far as her performance in this movie was concerned, it was completely flat. She just didn't seem to have much in the way of emotion in this movie. She always reacted very plainly to anything that happened in the movie. Anything that was dramatic, anything that was comedic, she just had the same expression on her face, and it just felt like she didn't really care about her performance in this movie. I like that they gave her a bit more characterization than they did with Lydia in the fact that she has a daughter, and there are a few scenes of her spending time with her daughter, and they have a good relationship clearly, and you can see that evolve over the course of the movie. But outside of that, there's just not really much to pick away from. The villains in this movie are cartoon level bad. It's almost like they stepped out of a 1980s episode of G.I. Joe and decided to start masquerading around in 21st century clothing. The villains of this movie are so uninspired that even their names are totally corny. Bobby Cannavale plays the main antagonist of this movie, who's running for mayor of the city. Now, he has a full name in the movie itself, but he prefers to have others call him by his nickname, the King. Not just King though, because if you call him King, he's going to get real upset. It's very important that you have that 3-letter word at the beginning. I couldn't really tell you what the King's superpower was supposed to be in this movie. Sure, there's a few scenes where his eyes glow red and he clearly possesses superhuman strength, but aside from that, there's nothing really else to go by. He's more or less just your average tank of a supervillain. He also has a henchwoman in the form of Laser, who's performed by Pom Klementieff. I'm pretty sure I said that name right. Now, aside from the fact that that's an absolutely god-awful name to give to your supervillain, I actually quite like Laser in this movie. She actually managed to come across as more of a supervillain compared to the King in this movie, because you actually get to see more of her superpowers being used, and she actually poses a legitimate threat to Thunder Force. I just totally realized I forgot why Emily and Lydia call themselves Thunder Force, and the reason for that is... I mean, technically there is a reason why that name is in this movie, but it's not a very good one. Lydia just lists off a bunch of random names that are all terrible except for Thunder Force, and that's the one that they home in on. Anyway, I thought Laser was a decent enough character. We get to see her use her superpowers more than anyone else in this movie, which is great because that's the point of watching a superhero movie to begin with. It's just a shame that her writing and comedic timing wasn't quite as good in comparison, although that's definitely not the actress's fault. Honestly, the only character to me that was truly funny in this movie, and I'm probably going to be a bit controversial when I say this, was the Crab, who's performed by Jason Bateman in this movie. I don't know what it was about Crab. I feel like I should have hated every fiber of this character's being, but I couldn't help but love him. The reason why he's called Crab is because he has 2 crab arms. Literally, that's it. The only reason why he's called Crab is because he has 2 crab arms. He doesn't have anything in the way of superpowers, and he's not even particularly threatening. The only reason why he's called Crab is because he's literally got crab arms. It feels like Jason Bateman knew that he was in an awful movie when he started in this role, and he just decided to roll along with it and have fun, and I love that kind of lackadaisical attitude. I feel like it comes across really well in this movie. But too bad Crab is involved in some of the more cringeworthy scenes in this movie. For some reason, the filmmakers decided it was a good idea to put up a romance angle between Crab and Lydia. It's literally love at first sight for them. Lydia goes to the store that Crab is attempting to rob, they lock eyes with each other, and then the scene starts to transition to a dark lit stage with a Glenn Frey song playing in the background, and they're completely dressed in 80s getup, hair and dress and everything, and I was groaning throughout this entire scene. My soul was absolutely hurting the entire time this moment played out on the screen. In between all of these cringeworthy scenes that are happening in the movie, there's just very little in the way of action. Prior to that moment in the convenience store that Crab is attempting to rob, that's actually their first gig, by the way, as superheroes, it takes 45 minutes for the action to start kicking off. The entire part after Lydia gets the serum injected into her up until they become Thunder Force and start going out and helping people, it just consists of trials, which are more or less just a series of humorless segments where Melissa McCarthy tries desperately to be funny. And like I said before, anyone who's seen a Melissa McCarthy movie in the past knows exactly what they're getting into at this point in the movie. It's just a lot of physical gags, mostly in the form of Lydia tripping over herself, a lot of unnecessary fat jokes, a lot of weird noises coming out of her mouth, just basically any kind of obnoxious thing that you can think of in an attempt to try and get laughs out of the audience. And their superpowers are so bland and boring, by the way. Lydia has super strength, so she refers to herself as Hammer, and then Emily has the power to become invisible, so she's referred to as Bingo, because there's almost no authentic superhero action in this movie. Nothing that you'd see compared to a Marvel or DC movie anyway. There's only one decent action set piece in this movie, and it occurs at the very end when Emily and Lydia are battling the King and trying to save the city. And honestly, I don't think this movie is worth sitting through just to get to that one scene at the end. This movie was terrible. Not quite as bad as The Misadventures of Eddie and Coke Man, which I reviewed earlier this year, but it comes very close to topping it. Ben Falcone, the writer and director of this movie, has written a lot of features with his wife Melissa McCarthy in the past, and honestly, after seeing this movie, I just think he needs to stay away from filmmaking. I'm sure he may have made more than their overall budget for some of his movies in the past, and he may have some sort of following, but I just plain don't think his movies are funny at all. They are absolute cringe to the max. If you want to watch a superhero comedy movie, you're better off rewatching all the Marvel and DC movies that have already come out in the past, because in terms of being a great superhero comedy, this ain't it, Chief. This movie was an absolute chore to sit through, and I am glad that it is over with. If this is the best that Netflix can do to put out for superhero movies, I am not impressed. Anyways, guys, that's gonna wrap up my review of Thunder Force. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the Korean crime drama, Night in Paradise. Bye-bye.